title of my talk today is Updating Incoherent Credences, Extending the Dutch Strategy Argument for Conditionalization. And as I just said, this is joint work with Glauber de Bona, who's at the University of Sao Paulo in computer engineering. And yeah, he says hi. He's sorry he can't be here today. Okay, so here's a question that Glauber and I started to become interested in, which is, how should incoherent agents update their credences when they learn new information? And our motivation for thinking about this question was that real-life agents often don't have coherent credences, right? So when you look at sort of psychology and cognitive science and how when they study like human reasoning, often they think that maybe humans are kind of like approximate Bayesian agents, but like nobody thinks real human reasoners are like perfect Bayesian agents. So, and it seems like at the moment, we don't really have a way of identifying desirable updating plans for these agents. But of course, we know that incoherent agents update their credences all the time, and we want to know what makes their updating plans good. So the problem is, we have the standard answer from the Bayesian framework about how agents should update, which is to conditionalize, right? If you learn something with certainty, you should employ the conditionalization rule to update. But that's only defined for initially coherent agents. But it seems pretty intuitive that even if you have an incoherent agent, that incoherent agent could update in better and worse ways. So what we want to find is a desirable property of updates that applies both to initially coherent agents and to initially incoherent agents. So here's an example. Take agents who have the following starting credences over here. So these are incoherent, right? Because if this person were coherent, the B credence here should be the sum of the first two credences, but it's not. So they're starting incoherent. Now, let's see how we can compare these two updating plans. So for Jane, when Jane learns B, her plan is to give A 0.5 credence and not A also 0.5 credence. And then we have Clara, and Clara plans to give A a 0.3 credence if she learns that B is true, and a 0.7 credence to not A. Now they're both coherent after they update on B, but if we kind of look back at the starting credences, it seems like Jane's updating plan is a bit better because it seems just more in line with the starting credences, right? Because the A and not A credences before B is learned, they give equal weight to these. And it just seems like Jane's updating plan is kind of more communicating with that better than Clara's updating plan. Okay, but that's just an intuition for now. Like there's a question of like, can we somehow find some explanation for why we think that? Okay, so here's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out by briefly explaining the Dutch strategy argument for conditionalization. Then I'm going to introduce some incoherence measures that Glauber and I have worked on in previous work. Then I'm going to define a new kind of incoherence that we call plan incoherence. And with plan incoherence, we can introduce kind of a generalization of conditionalization that we call tolerant conditionalization. Then I'm going to sort of introduce conditional credences into the framework, which we initially leave out to make it simpler. And then later I'm going to tell you a little bit about how you can use alternative incoherence measures to define this property that we're interested in. And I'm also going to explain how this all relates to accuracy considerations, because of course that's sort of the other big type of argument that people put forth to support conditionalization for coherent agents. All right, let's do it. So, the Dutch strategy argument, you're probably familiar with it. It's usually taken to show that initially coherent agents who have non-conditionalizing updating plans are irrational because they can be Dutch booked. So there's like some controversy in the literature about how exactly to formulate the version of conditionalization that is supported by a Dutch strategy argument. And one formulation that we adopt here that's pretty widely accepted is rule conditionalization. So if upon learning some evidence A with certainty and no other evidence, the agent plans to update their credence in claim B to CRA-B, then their planned credence equals their current credence in B conditional on A. So basically the plan for the update should equal the current conditional credence, assuming that the agent's credence in A, the learned proposition, is greater than 0. And then it's standardly assumed that the conditional credence of B given A should relate to the agent's unconditional credences via the standard ratio formula that you have here. So nothing fancy happening here. So just to kind of remind you what a Dutch strategy argument roughly looks like. So you could use these starting credences. Now here you can see that I made them coherent, right? Because now the credence in B is actually the sum of these two credences. And now if this person had conditionalizing plans, it would require that they update their credence in A when they learn B to 0.5, but we're gonna just assume that they are not conditionalizing. So their plan is to actually set their credence in A to 0.4 if they learn that B. Now, basically then what you can do is you can Dutch book the agent. There are sort of two bets that get exchanged initially, and then we find out whether B is true or false. And then basically if B is false, the agent loses money from the first two bets. And if B is true, the bookie then exchanges a third bet with the agent. And either way, the agent loses money. And this is called a Dutch strategy because we have the bets happening at two different times. Whereas in a regular Dutch book, you just have all the bets happening at the same time. So yeah, so the details aren't that important. Just sort of like that's a general kind of strategy. Okay, now here are some important limitations of the standard Dutch strategy argument. When you see standard Dutch strategy arguments in the literature, they usually assume that the agents are initially coherent. And then the argument says, oh, now look what happens if this initially coherent agent doesn't update by conditionalization. Oh, then we can set up this diachronic Dutch book. Now, why is that? Well, the thing is, in a Dutch strategy, you can't really tell where the incoherence is coming from. So if you make a Dutch strategy argument against an agent who already starts with incoherent credences, then it doesn't matter what their updating plans are. They're going to lose money no matter what, because their initial starting credences, regardless of the update, already generate a loss. So you just, for initially incoherent agents, you don't get this contrast where like some updating plans don't give you a guaranteed loss, but some of them do. The initial incoherence sort of like brings in a guaranteed loss to begin with. So here's what we decided we want to do then. What we want to do is we want to delineate incoherence that is located just in the agent's updating plans. So we're going to try and basically carve apart initial incoherence and sort of updating incoherence. And then we're going to argue that desirable updating plans should minimize this incoherence that's in the updating plans. Okay, so let's start with some basics of how to measure incoherence. And this is from previous work that Glauber and I have done, and that also Glauber has done with some other collaborators. So incoherence is typically measured in two different ways. One way you can do it is via maximum Dutch book loss, but you can also use distance measures and then measure distance to coherence. So the first way is basically to somehow constrain the betting prices, right? Because if we want to measure how incoherent you are by the kind of money you would be guaranteed to lose in a Dutch book, Well, of course we could like scale the bets up and down, but that doesn't do anything to your incoherence. So we need to somehow like normalize the betting scenario so we can make things comparable. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is this distance-based strategy, where what you do is you take an incoherent agent's credence function, you write it out as a vector, like so. You just like write all the credences in the different propositions next to each other. And then you pick some distance measure that measures distance between vectors. And you check how far away is this vector to the closest vector that corresponds to a probabilistic credence assignment on the same set of propositions. And one of the nice things that Glauber has shown in his work is that there is a way of correlating the two. So if you constrain the bets in the first strategy and say the stakes of each bet can be at most $1 or £1 or whatever, and then for the second strategy, you use absolute or Manhattan distance between vectors, those two ways of measuring incoherence give you the same results for unconditional credences. So you can either say, hey, how Manhattan close are you to the closest coherent credences, or how much are you guaranteed to lose from a set of bets with stakes of at most 1, same answer. So kind of two ways of doing the same thing. Cool. Now, here's an example. Suppose you have somebody whose credences are incoherent because they don't sum to 1. There's more than one coherent credence function that is absolute distance closest to this, but one of them is, for example, this one. And so basically then when you measure the distance, right, you just measure the difference between the A credences and the difference between the not A credences, and you sum that together, and you get 0.3 for your distance. Same answer if we use the betting strategy. So if the agent sells a betting ticket that pays $1 if A is true for 30 cents, and another betting ticket that pays $1 if not A is true for 40 cents, right? Then they take in 70 cents, but of course they have to pay out $1 because one of the bets is going to win. So they're going to be out 30 cents no matter what happens. So you can sort of see how you get the same answer either way. Okay. Now, this is all pretty simple when we go with unconditional credences, but we also need to extend this to conditional credences. And when we use conditional credences, we can still measure incoherence by using maximum guaranteed loss from Dutch books. And to make it simpler, one thing we can do is we can, instead of making diachronic Dutch books, we can actually use conditional bets for the person's updating plans, where the bets the conditional bets are called off when the conditioning proposition is false. So basically there's like a synchronic Dutch book with conditional bets that's kind of giving you the same answer as if you did the diachronic Dutch book with the updates at 2 different times. And so that's one way you can do it, where again, we keep the stakes for each bet at most 1. And there's also a corresponding distance measure that we can use instead if we want. And this is kind of a violation measure. The basic idea of how this works is that you convert all of the credences to conditional credences. So, and unconditional credences, you just make them into conditional credences, conditional on tautologies. And then you can define, using the ratio formula, these like violation terms, and you sort of ask, okay, what's the distance between a probability measure and this possibly incoherent credence function that the agent has. So if you get positive values for these epsilons, there's kind of a difference between a probabilistic credence function and the one that you actually have. And you get, again, sort of like a distance-based incoherence measure for the agent. But again, you have the same nice sort of correspondence between the Dutch book way of doing it and the distance way of doing it. Okie dokie. So here is one application of incoherence measures that I talk about in my book, and that gives us kind of an inspiration for our strategy for the conditionalization property that we're after. What I talk about in the book is this type of reasoning that I call augmentative reasoning. And what you're imagining is just an agent who doesn't have like a fully filled in credence function. There are certain propositions that they can entertain or sentences that they can entertain, but they haven't thought about what credence to assign to it yet. And then the question is, well, how should they fill in their missing credences? So like, you know, there's like a non-creedal kind of belief version of this that's very common, right? So you're like, oh, what should I think about Q? Well, I believe P, and I believe if P then Q. Well, so I guess what I believe entails that I should believe Q, so maybe I should believe Q, right? So it's sort of just the creedal version of that. Here's a constraint. You might think that's a reasonable constraint on augmentative reasoning. When you fill in gaps in your credence function like that, you should not do so in such a way that increases your incoherence. So what that means for coherent agents is that you should fill gaps in your credence function by extending your existing credence assignments in accordance with the probability axioms, right? So if your existing credences together with the probability axioms give you either a precise assignment for these missing credences or like a range, you should, you know, stay with those assignments, because otherwise you're going to make your credences more incoherent, and that seems like a bad thing to do. Now, for incoherent agents, we can prove that you can fill the gaps in a way that also doesn't increase your existing incoherence. And the way to do that is to look towards credences that would be recommended or that would cohere with some closest coherent credence assignment to your existing credences. So basically, like if you pick those credences, then you don't increase the incoherence of your credences. Okay, so here's the strategy then for what we're trying to do here. So we're going to measure the incoherence of the agent's credal strategy, which is the agent's initial credences together with their updating plans. And we're going to say that good updating plans should not make an agent's incoherence worse. And to define that a bit more rigorously, we adopt this notion that we call plan incoherence. Here's what plan incoherence is. You measure a coherent or incoherent agent's maximum sure loss from a Dutch strategy. Then you measure the maximum sure loss considering just their initial credences without the updating plans, and then you calculate the difference, right? So that's the agent's plan incoherence, which is just the extra incoherence that comes from their updating plans. So to make it a little bit more formal, so we're going to measure the agent's credal strategy incoherence via this Dutch strategy measure, where we keep all betting states at most one. So that's all comparable, right? So we're going to say, okay, how can we Dutch book this agent in the maximal way, taking all their updating plans and their initial credences together? We don't have to do this Dutch strategy thing, right? We can convert the agent's updating plans into conditional credences, and then we can just make it into a synchronous Dutch book, which is just a little easier for calculation purposes. But we can, we just get an equivalence there. So when we have the maximum Dutch strategy loss from the updating plans and the initial credences together, we then look just at the incoherence contained in the agent's initial credences, and we compute the difference to see if the incoherence increases due just to the updating plans. And so for now, we're going to just assume that the agent has just initial unconditional credences and updating plans. We're going to enter in conditional credences later. Okay, so let me show you an example because that makes it, I think, a lot easier to see how it works. So we already saw this example earlier. So we have an agent here who has initial coherent credences, right? So these initial unconditional credences, they would not give rise to any Dutch book laws. But we also said that this is not the updating plan that this agent should have. This agent should actually have an updating plan to give A a 0.5 credence upon learning B, not 0.4. So when we then calculate the incoherence of this entire strategy, we find that we get a guaranteed loss of 0.08. We know that just the initial unconditional credences have an incoherence of 0. So that means we get a plan incoherence of 0.08, which is just coming from the agent adopting these updating plans. So plan incoherence is this really important property that we need to define our desirable property of updates. There are two facts about plan incoherence that are important for us. The first one is that plan incoherence can never be negative. Like the best thing that can happen when you add your updating plans to your credences is that they don't make you more incoherent. The updating plans can never make you less incoherent, right? So plan incoherence can never be negative. And regardless of whether you start with coherent or incoherent unconditional initial credences, there are always updating plans available to you that generate 0 plan incoherence. So, so regardless of whether you start coherent or incoherent, there's always going to be some updating plan you can adopt that's not going to make you worse in terms of incoherence. And well, what are these updating plans that don't make you worse? Intuitively, when you start from an incoherent place, you think about a probability measure that is Manhattan closest to your actual credences, so like the closest coherent credences to you. If the agent adopts updating plans that cohere with that closest to you coherent credence function, then those updating plans have 0 plan incoherence. So you're basically updating in the way recommended by the closest coherent credences to you. Okay, so, well, the slogan then would be update in the way recommended by some Manhattan closest coherent credence function. And an agent's credal strategy has this property of satisfying tolerant conditionalization if the agent's credal strategy has 0 plan incoherence. Well, why should you obey tolerant conditionalization? Well, one sort of obvious reason is that if you violate tolerant conditionalization, it means that you're making your Dutch strategy vulnerability higher than it needs to be. Like sort of you're adding sort of additional incoherence that you could avoid. Now, one nice thing is that for coherent agents, tolerant conditionalization just recommends conditionalizing, because for coherent agents, the tolerant conditionalizing updates are just the conditionalizing updates that don't make you more incoherent. That's kind of pretty intuitive, I think. And then for incoherent agents, tolerant conditionalization recommends conservative updating. So it's basically telling you to follow the updating plan that's generated by what you might think is a conservative coherentization of your existing credences. And here's another interesting feature of tolerant conditionalization. You know, we can think about what happens when you learn a tautology. When a coherent agent updates on a tautology, nothing happens to their credences, right? It just spits out the same ones that were put in. For incoherent agents, if an incoherent agent updates on learning a tautology, tolerant conditionalization says that the agent should move to one of the closest coherent credence functions. So it's kind of like a coherentizing update that is recommended by tolerant conditionalization. Okay, so couple of clarifications here. So tolerant conditionalization is just like standard conditionalization in that it's not supposed to be a rule that guides people's updates in their heads, right? So standard conditionalization is not a rule where we say, yeah, we're just going to teach this to our students, and then they start going around conditionalizing when they learn stuff, and then they're like really rational, right? Like, it's not supposed to be that way. It's just supposed to say, if this person has these starting credences and they get this information, this is what they should end up with. This is like the best update they could make, regardless of psychologically speaking how they get there, right? So we're saying the same thing. Tolerant conditionalization says this is the best update this person could arrive at, however they might get there. And then there is an important difference between tolerant conditionalization and regular conditionalization, because we don't think tolerant conditionalization should have the status of a rational requirement, right? So standard conditionalization is usually presented that way, that you're definitely irrational if you don't follow it. We think tolerant conditionalization is kind of weaker. We think that it identifies a good-making property of updating plans, but we think that there could sometimes be a situation where agents could have overriding reasons to not obey tolerant conditionalization, right? So what tolerant conditionalization does is it tells you to move to sort of like a conservative update of your credences that is coherent. But maybe you could be in a scenario where you actually kind of know why your credences are incoherent, like sort of what broke them in the first place and how to kind of like fix this error. And it's possible that the way you know to fix the error is different from what tolerant conditionalization might recommend. And in that case, it seems like you have like overriding reasons to violate tolerant conditionalization, right? Because you have like better information for how to fix your incoherent credences. Okay, so we're going back now to our initial example, right? We had Jane and Clara who shared the same starting credences. And if we use our measures, we find that the initial incoherence in their credences is 0.1. And now what we want to know is, well, what's their plan incoherence? So for Clara, with her updating plans, it turns out that if we add her updating plans in together with her starting credences, it doesn't actually make her incoherence worse, which means her plan incoherence is 0. She obeys tolerant conditionalization. By contrast, Clara's updating plan, if we add that in with the starting credences and compute the sure loss from her credal strategy, we get a sure loss of 0.23, right? And so 0.23 minus 1 is 0.13. So we see that her updating plans actually add in more incoherence than was contained in her initial credences. So this violates tolerant conditionalization. So we see that actually our intuition from the beginning can be vindicated, that Jane has better updating plans than Clara, even though they both start incoherent. So now, so far, we've only looked at agents who have unconditional credences and updating plans. And we said that for convenience reasons, we can sometimes just convert the updating plans and treat them like conditional credences because it makes the Dutch books kind of easier. Oh, whoopsie, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go. But we think it's good to actually separately be able to represent the agent's conditional credences as well. So there's some subtle interpretive differences between what somebody's updating plans are and what their conditional credences are. So you might think a conditional credence is your credence here in A when you suppose that B is true. And your updating plan is your plan for changing your credence when you learn that something is true. And of course, in coherent agents, their conditional credences and updating plans should be the same. But there's some psychological evidence where people have tried to kind of tease this apart in real thinkers. And yeah, there's some evidence from empirical research that suggests that we can't assume that in real agents, their conditional credences and updating plans are always the same. And because we want to be able to represent the different ways in which actual agents can be incoherent, we think it's kind of nice to be able to have those represented differently. So one little trick we have to then use in the framework is we have to make sure we avoid duplication, right? So if an agent already has this updating plan here, but they also have a conditional credence in A given B, right? Then what we want to do is just, we represent their updating plan as a conditional credence, but we use like something that's equivalent, logically equivalent to A here in the representation, just so that we don't have a system that makes it look like the agent has like two different credences in the same conditional expression. But this is sort of just, this is just sort of making sure that our framework is not too impoverished and we can represent both updating plans and conditional credences. Now, one thing that is interesting here is that tolerant conditionalization can recommend updating plans that violate the ratio formula or updating plans that are different from the corresponding conditional credences, right? This can't happen in coherent agent. In coherent agents, tolerant conditionalization is always going to say, oh yeah, you should update according to your conditional credences, and of course, because they're related to the ratio with the ratio formula to the person's unconditional credences. But in incoherent agents, that's different. So we have an agent here who has initial incoherent credences, right? You can see here B and not B don't sum to 1 at all. But then we can say like, okay, suppose we just compute what their conditional credence in A given B should be by the ratio formula kind of sticking in this these incoherent unconditional credences. We have an initial incoherence of 0.28 here. So now we can say, well, what happens if Alice's updating plan actually matches this conditional credence that we gathered with the ratio formula from her unconditional credences? Well, it turns out it actually gives her some plan incoherence. So tolerant conditionalization would not recommend doing that. By contrast, look at Bob, right? Bob has an updating plan to go to a credence of 0.5 in A upon learning B. And it turns out that that actually has 0 plan incoherence, even though this credence is not related to his unconditional credences via the ratio formula, right? So these connections between conditional and unconditional credences via the ratio formula, they kind of dissolve in the incoherent case. Tolerant conditionalization does not like preserve those. So now, one thing to talk about here is the use of alternative incoherence measures. Because, we picked out a Dutch book measure that I presented earlier that we think is a really good one, but that's not the only one you could use. And there's some literature by Schervisch, Seidenfeld, and Cadane who define a whole set of Dutch book measures that have like interestingly different properties. And in principle, you could use any of these incoherence measures that they define to define a different version of tolerant conditionalization. So you would just say, okay, this tolerant conditionalization for alternative incoherence measure would then just say that the agent's creedal strategy has 0 plan incoherence according to this other measure. We do like the measure that we pick. I can say a little bit more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. One further feature of the measure that we like is that it actually plays really nicely with cases in which you can interpret the incoherent credences as consistent probability upper or lower bounds. So if the credences of the agent can be seen in that way, then obeying our version of tolerant conditionalization is equivalent to conditionalizing a probability measure that satisfies these upper or lower bounds. So that's kind of a nice property that you get out of using this particular incoherence measure in terms of Dutch books. Now, of course, Dutch book arguments are not the only arguments that people have used to support conditionalization, and there's sort of a variety of accuracy arguments on the market. You're probably familiar with these expected utility or expected accuracy arguments for conditionalization. Graham Oddie has one, Greaves and Wallace have presented versions of that. The problem with these expectation-based arguments is that it's really awkward to try to calculate expectations with incoherent starting points. So those are not so good for our purposes. But Ray Briggs and Richard Pettigrew have a dominance argument for conditionalization. And that is kind of an interesting one for us to look at. What their argument says is that any non-conditionalizing or incoherent creedal strategy, where a creedal strategy is like a pair of initial starting credences and updating plans, is accuracy dominated by another creedal strategy that is coherent and conditionalizing, but coherent and conditionalizing strategies are not so dominated. And we can adapt their argument to define a desirable property of updating plans for agents with incoherent initial credences. And the basic idea is that if an agent is incoherent, their updating plans are flawed if every single dominating creedal strategy has updating plans that are different from their plans, right? So basically, like, no matter which dominating creedal strategy we look at, none of these strategies shares an updating plan with the current creedal strategy that the agent has adopted. So that's supposed to be like the bad property. Whereas, like, if you kind of flip it around, right, the good property would be if you're incoherent, but there are some dominating strategies that that actually share your plans. Okay, so right, so this means we can generate the definition of one of these inaccuracy stable updating plans. And in A, it's just an inaccuracy measure that evaluates creedal strategies in possible worlds. So I'm going to just read you the technical definition, and then I'm going to say what it means. So in A, stability is the property that goes as follows. Given non-probabilistic credences CR, the updating plans CR plan are in A stable if there is a probabilistic conditionalizing creedal strategy, CR star, together with CR plan, that is more NA accurate than CR merged with CR plan in all possible worlds. So the idea is an incoherent agent's updating plans are stable in this way, just in case they match the updating plans in at least one of the creedal strategies that dominates them, right? So if the agent were moving to a dominating creedal strategy, they could keep their updating plans. That's supposed to be the sort of good property. Whereas if no matter which dominating strategy you would move to, you would have to change your updating plans. That means there's something wrong with them. Okay, so now suppose that you have one of these additive inaccuracy measures in A that's based on a proper scoring rule. Now we can use that to define an incoherence measure. I can say a little bit more about that in the Q&A if you want. Basically, this incoherence measure that sort of matches with the inaccuracy measure is, again, a measure that is defined as minimum distance to coherence. And so if we use this incoherence measure as our measure to define a version of tolerant conditionalization, right? So if we say, oh, according to this incoherence measure, your plan incoherence doesn't increase from these updating plans, that implies the stability property, right? So here's maybe an example that makes it a little bit clearer. So we have this measure I2 that measures incoherence as the Euclidean distance to the closest coherent credences. Then we can say, okay, let's use that measure to define a version of tolerant conditionalization where, good updating plans are ones that don't increase your plan incoherence according to this incoherence measure. Then those updating plans that satisfy that version of tolerant conditionalization are also Breyer stable. That means the agent is allowed to keep these updating plans when moving to a Breyer dominating creedal strategy. So that's that. And now we have sort of these two different ways of thinking about tolerant conditionalization. There's sort of the accuracy-based way where we say, oh, it's good to have these stable updating plans, and we still have our original version of tolerant conditionalization that was based on this standardized Dutch book measure that we introduced. So we were wondering, are they compatible or not? And the good news is that we found that they are often compatible. So especially in the case where the agent assigns their unconditional initial credences to a partition, and we have our inaccuracy measure as an additive one that's based on a proper scoring rule, then it's always possible for the agent to satisfy both our standard tolerant conditionalization that we introduced earlier and to have these stable updating plans according to this accuracy-based definition that we introduced. And we think that's kind of important because we think that, Dutch book arguments and accuracy arguments, if possible, should basically kind of be sort of two roads to the same place. Like they should, if possible, kind of have overlapping things that they endorse. Okay, let me sum up. So what we wanted to do was identify a desirable property of updating plans that can be applied to agents with either coherent initial credences or incoherent initial credences. And we used a Dutch book-based incoherence measure to define the notion of plan incoherence, which is just the incoherence that stems from an agent's updating plans. And then using this notion of plan incoherence, we defined our desirable property of updating plans. We said that a person's creedal strategy obeys tolerant conditionalization when their creedal strategy has zero plan incoherence. So when their updating plans don't generate any additional incoherence. We also said a little bit about why the measure we use to define tolerant conditionalization is desirable. But again, if you have like a preferred incoherence measure for some reason that you want to use, you can just use that to define your version of tolerant conditionalization that you prefer. We had initially left conditional credences out of the framework, but then we showed that we can actually integrate them and we can model cases where a person has conditional credences that diverge from their updating plans. And then lastly, we also explained the relationship between tolerant conditionalization and accuracy. We identified that there is a class of cases in which an agent does not have to choose between having these inaccuracy stable updating plans and having updating plans that obey standard tolerant conditionalization. And that's all I got.